Hello everyone, welcome back to LifePoint Cap OT90 Challenge. And we are at the final stretch of our reading of the 90 Challenge. So I want to continue to encourage you, let's read and let's really be soaked into God's Word together. All right? All right, good. Now we are reading the book of Daniel starting today as we are finishing Ezekiel today. Daniel and his friends have been taken into an exile as young men, very elite young teenagers, to be educated as diplomats and scholars in the court of Babylon. So King Nebuchadnezzar and his officers, they went to Jerusalem and they picked out those who are elites of the Jews and they took them to Babylon to educate them and to serve the court of Babylon. So if you think about the empires that I share with you, Daniel, he served Babylonian Empire into the Persian Empire. So Assyrians, so fall of Assyrians, Babylonian Empire, or at the very beginning of it, and the ending of it into the Persian Empire. So Daniel had ministered about 70 years, but compared to his years of serving, the writing that we have is really short, only 12 chapters. Okay? Now, so he ministered for 70 years, and in the book, out of 12 chapters, chapters 1 through 6 are very famous. And you might have heard the stories from the radio, from someone else, or even other quotes that are that are coming from the book of Daniel from 1 through 6. And 7 to 12 are prophecies about future that's coming in the later times. So there are famous stories, starting with Daniel refusing to eat, fiery furnace, or Daniel interpreting dreams about King Nebuchadnezzar, or even actually the Babylonian Empire falling with the killing of King Belshazzar when there was a writing on the wall and Daniel interpreted that, and that very same night, kingdom of Babylon actually fell down as Persian came into power, or about Lion's Den. So those are the famous stories that we can really read quickly, especially for 6 chapters of Daniel. Now, from 7 to 12, it's all prophecy about future. And it's about future kingdoms and kings and nations that will be rising after certain kings and so forth. But he does that with dreams and visions that are very hard to understand, with imageries or creatures and so forth. So with the coming kingdoms like Hellenistic Empire or Roman Empire or future kingdom, Daniel prophesies about what God has been showing him, what God has been telling him in his book. Now, all those dreams and visions proclaim God's sovereignty over kings, nations, and the empires. One more time, all those dreams, even with the stories in 1 through 6, proclaim God's sovereignty over the kings, nations, and empires. Not only the nation of Judah, not only North Israel or God's people, but God's sovereignty over all. And I think that message is something that we really have to take in as people now, as we are going through different ideologies or divisions and thoughts and so forth, that God is in control. God is sovereign over kings, nations, and empires. Even in the midst of that, the message of Daniel is you and I, or Daniel and his friends, or Jews, or God's people, as God's people, we are to live in faith. Okay, we are to live in faith in the midst of unbelieving world and trusting God for deliverance and protection. Trusting God for deliverance and protection, just like Daniel and his friends have done in the book. Okay? So in the midst of what's going on around the world, people of God, people of faith are to live in faith, believing in God's deliverance, in God's protection, as he is sovereign over kings, nations, and empires. Now, I have a theme verse of the book of Daniel in chapter 6, verses 26 to 27. Let me read them for us. It says this: I make a decree that in all my royal dominion, people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. All right, Life Point, continue to read and see you tomorrow.